rapporteur. I have to do two things. One is collect material and give a closing day summary in 15 minutes of what happened during the week. And then with a bit more time, I deliver a report, it's looking like 70 odd pages this year, on what was Bordeaux 2015, going through the different sessions, pulling out lessons learned and so on. So this 15-20 minutes can't be a substitute for that. So if something's missing, by all means ask a question, or alternatively wait until the report's out. We hope that we're going to publish it towards the end of next week. So Bordeaux was organised around these headline topics. They didn't appear out of nowhere. 6 of them were very much continuities from the previous European Congress in Vienna, and then the previous World Congress in Vienna, and then the European Congresses that we've had since in Dublin and Helsinki. So this just illustrates the path, the continuity. We know because delegates tell us that they like things to be looked at for a minimum of 2 years, perhaps 3 years, so that there's the opportunity to picture and see how things are developing. So that's what we try to do. Bordeaux was big. If you were there, you will know that. Very large number of parallel sessions. Apologies for that. The Congress, if I can use an analogy, the Congress is landscape shaped, and it really ought to be portrait. It would be nice to run fewer sessions, but we would need to take the premises for a longer time. And people say it's hard enough getting 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 days to go to a World Congress. A week just isn't possible. So there's just a quick pictorial summary of what went on. And here with a bit more detail, in all 270 sessions. If you were there and you thought it was busy, you were right. And there are the reasons. We've tried very hard over the years to put as many sessions as we can either in the exhibition or alongside the exhibition. It's popular with the exhibitors, it's popular with delegates. You can go to a session on something, when it finishes, you can go out, you can go to the relevant part of the exhibition and go and look at something, touch something, ride on something that's relevant to what you've just been talking about. And a few numbers. We exceeded our targets. It was the biggest exhibition we've ever had in Europe, largest number of companies, largest number of demonstrations. We were particularly pleased with those. And we also had, which was very pleasing in one respect, it was a very high level recognition. We had the Ministerial Roundtable on ITS and climate change. It was also a damn nuisance because so many police emerged to look after the visiting ministers and so on, that it interrupted the free flow of people. But that's the penalty you have whenever you do anything like a Ministerial Roundtable. And we've had back feedback from the delegates. There were their comments. We seem to be getting it mostly right. The delegates are seeming happy with what's been provided. It's not perfect. We're still working on where we can make improvements. Some of the things in Bordeaux were annoying. The physical layout could have been better, but the buildings are where they are. And we tried hard with the driverless shuttle going between them. It wasn't quite enough, and we couldn't stop it raining. So, same information, slightly different format, just showing the development as far as Europe's concerned from Stockholm in 2009 through Vienna to Bordeaux. Now, these 14 one-liners are to some extent a summary of what's in the 70-page report I talked about. So I'm just going to fatten up each one of them, just say a little bit more about it. Number one, deployment. Bordeaux was all about deployment, especially for the connected and the highly automated vehicles. It's clear that the market's moving. It's going from supplier push to one of user pull. The space topic was one that we had some slight reservations about. We realized that there was a danger that we talk a great deal about space and all of the possibilities for going and having a look at the far side of planets, which was not what a transport conference is interested in. We need not have worried. It was extremely popular. And the surprise for many, including me, is that space-based telecoms and space-based position location are coming down in price. The resilience is going up. There's competition. There's more satellite constellations going up. This is all moving in the right direction as far as the customer is concerned. 3 and 4 are connected. Obvious word. 3 and 4 are linked. The 3 was saying that many sessions and a very large number of papers looked at connected and automated vehicles. It's clear that ITS is moving very fast in the direction of real deployment. The demonstrations have shown how you put the pieces together to get benefits, but we haven't yet seen strong evidence on what's the business case. Now, the European Commission has got its cooperative ITS platform and is working on that. Where are the costs? Where are the benefits? What's the business case? And that leads into 4. We do need more real data about deployment impact assessments. There's a lot of unease, particularly with local government. They do something and they're not keen to tell people about it. I suspect because they fear criticism that they've only scored 93% and not 100. But we do need the information post-deployment of what's the actual impact on the ground. 5 and 6 are linked, and they're all about the same subject, that connected vehicles, the Internet of Things, connectivity, it's opening up vulnerabilities. A connected car is always going to be exposed to physical or remote attack, so the protection has to be very carefully designed, and the protection for vehicles is not the same as that for desktop PCs and nomadic devices. So a lot of discussion there about we haven't yet got it right. We need to do more work on the security of embedded systems. Number 7 was an intriguing one because it's not clear who wants to pay for highly automated vehicles and the infrastructure that they need. And there were some people saying a driverless vehicle doesn't need any special infrastructure. I don't think many people believe that. But the problem is that the benefits and the costs are in different places. And the road operators, the service providers, the auto manufacturers, government regulators and so on, they're still sitting in their own little silos. So this, in a sense, is a feeder into number 8 about we need more cooperation. We want the various players to work together. Number 9, this is me being rude. There was a lot of evidence that said the automotive industry hasn't woken up to nomadic devices. It's wedded to the idea that the wireless interface, the only wireless interface for a connected vehicle, will be the one that they build into the vehicle. And users are saying, no, I'm not satisfied with that. I've got a nomadic device of some sort. I may have a laptop, tablet, intelligent spectacles, intelligent watch, intelligent shoes, who knows. I will bring to the vehicle my particular digital world, and I expect it to be linked. And the automotive world isn't listening to that. Smart cities, much discussed, but often from the very limited point of view of smart traffic or smart environmental impact policies. The true smart city is much, much wider. It's transport, it's energy, it's waste systems, it's telecoms, and we've got a long way to go yet before we can really start talking seriously about smart cities. This is going to be the theme of our next European Congress in Glasgow next June. And linked into that, a lot more research is needed to understand what is going to be the impact of highly automated or driverless vehicles in inner cities. Very nice paper, if you've got access to the Bordeaux papers, very nice paper by a lady from the RAND Corporation who looks at about 10 questions. Will highly automated or driverless vehicles add to congestion, reduce congestion, do nothing to congestion? And in most cases, her conclusion is nobody knows. The evidence just isn't available yet. We thought Bordeaux was one of our best congresses for freight and logistics, but it's still the Cinderella subject. It's the one where everybody thinks about it a bit late in the day. We need more focus on it, because, not least because it may well be where the driverless vehicles are first deployed. And we're very pleased that the Future Freight theme in Melbourne is going to look at this. And I see signs that it's one you're looking at for Montreal as well. So that would be good. And the last two about this rather fashionable topic of mobility. There was a lot of talk about it, a lot of discussion, not many original ideas, if the truth is told. But there was one original move. Vertico announced it had set up the Mobility as a Service Alliance, and I think just over 40 organisations have joined and more are joining. So a very rapid run through of the outcomes as I saw them with my closing summary from Bordeaux. Much more detail when the report comes out next week. I'm just drawing attention to a couple of things which to me really do epitomise what is the benefit of a Congress. We had 7 stakeholder workshops and they all buzzed. They were all alive. They were busy. They were interesting. It's an opportunity because all of the right people are in the right place at the right time to pick up an issue and kick it around and talk about it with no obligation to come up with any particular output apart from a better state of knowledge. And for the same reason, because you know that the 10 people you want to talk to about powered two-wheelers and safety, they're all going to be in Bordeaux. We had a very large number of these so-called associated events. You will have the same in Montreal. It's going to be an attractive city to visit. People will want to go there, and people will say, well, we must take advantage of this and organise a meeting of fill in the gap. I mentioned the exhibition, very good for countering the fact that I put on about ½ kilo as a result of all the Bordeaux food. It was a rather strange shape. It was a very long rather than square, but it did have an enormous number of interesting exhibits in it. And the demonstrations, over 50 vehicles. I've not got the figure, but we've counted the number of trips or demonstration opportunities per person, and we're quite pleased. We gave a lot of people a trial of what was going on, including, as I mentioned earlier, this little driverless shuttle that just went backwards and forwards all day between the 2 buildings' sites. We had 2 activities aimed at the younger generation. That was one of them. And in the case of the hackathon, we set the problem and then invited teams to have a look at it, see if they could solve it. And then we had the 24-hour student innovation competition, where we didn't set the problem, we just invited them to, to think creatively. And my colleague Amanda Strevens descended on them just after 2 in the morning, and she said she wasn't really surprised. They were all there, they were all working, the coffee machine was empty, but they certainly were doing their 24-hour duty. Now, this is just a refresher of the one you've seen. This is continuity pre-Congress. One of the things we asked the delegates is, what do you want next? We've got some clue to interest, topicality, and so on by the numbers of papers that came in, and also by the subjects of the special interest sessions. But very useful feedback we got from delegates was this. This is what they want at future congresses. There are things there that I think ought to be there but aren't, such as freight logistics. But again, I hope this is a benefit for Montreal, a very clear steer for you of what will be very useful. And what I've tried to do in the diagram is take some of the ideas, add these 10, and then add my own predictions to say, this is what I think is going to be lively in 2017. And I think that's probably all that I wanted to say. Yes, thank you if you came. Thank you for listening, and our very best wishes from Europe for your planning. We are with you wherever you need help.
Well, thank you, Eric. That's terrific. I'm looking to see if we have any questions from our audience at this stage. And while we look at that, I'm going to be switching control back over to me, Eric. So thank you very much. Just to get things started, I do have a question for you. There was some discussion that connected and automated vehicles as a topic will be old news by 2017. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Oh, no, no. Um, Two things. I think they need to be separated. Um, I think personally, connected is going to come in very fast, and that's certainly the case in Europe. That the benefits from connected are measurable now. The gains are pretty obvious now, and the market is ready to supply. In the case of Europe, it's just waiting for the Commission's steer on standards, interoperability, and the very, very sensitive issue: who actually owns the onboard data? If my car knows where I've been, does that belong to me, or does it belong to the manufacturer? The Commission has got an extremely clear view, and it's not the same as that of the automotive manufacturers. But I think in 2017 you'll be talking about deployment experience of connected, how to get more benefit, how to speed up, what are the best services, how do you optimize them. So it'll be sessions based on experience. 2017, I think we'll still be talking about highly automated and driverless, possibly with the exception of the freight world, or driverless vehicles for public transport. So that's obviously a personal view, but no, I don't think it'll be played out.
Well, thank you, Eric. We do have one question about whether or not attendees will get a copy of the presentation. The answer is yes. We're recording this as well as the presentations themselves will be posted on our ITS Canada website sometime within the next week or so. And Eric, I think that's all the questions we have right now. So I'm going to mute you if you don't
Okay.
mind. And then I'm going to ask Craig Hutton to come online. Craig, are you there?
I am, Rob.
Good. So I'd like to introduce Craig. Craig is the Director General of Strategic Policy and Innovation Directorate with Transport Canada. And Craig is also a Director of ITS Canada. He joined Transport Canada in 2006, has worked on strategic policy, and has developed and implemented a national policy framework for strategic gateways and trade corridors in 2009. He's led the development of the Atlantic Gateway Strategy, and in his current role, Craig provides leadership with regard to department-wide policy integration, including issues related to innovation and developing strategies that can advance Transport Canada's strategic objectives. He oversees Transport Canada's ITS policy research, analysis, and advice, so obviously a very welcome member of our board. He joined the board in 2015, and serving as Transport Canada's representative, he provides us with advice and ideas concerning technology trends and collaborating on initiatives of mutual interest. And recently he joined our committee, which is the International Business Development Committee, because Transport Canada, in many cases, leads the way to international business development opportunities for ITS Canada. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Carleton and a master's degree from the University of Western Ontario. So I'd like to now transfer control over to Craig, and hopefully Craig's presentation will be visible shortly. Craig, are you there?
I am. So we're just taking control now. Visible now?
Yes, we can see that. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Rob. Hi, everyone, and thanks very much for the opportunity to make a brief presentation and some of my perspective of what I heard in Bordeaux, which was an absolutely fantastic conference and a real education for me. And I obviously was there with sort of a public policy hat on, looking at how are other governments viewing the issues, opportunities around ITS, and particularly connected ITS technologies. So I was keenly attuned to both hearing some of the messages coming from sort of my counterparts in other countries and looking for opportunities to engage in discussions both formally in the workshops, of which there are a number of opportunities to do so, but engage in those discussions which drew out some of the policy issues and some of the issues that governments are starting to seize themselves with, and how they're articulating how well they're positioned to respond going forward in the future. So I did find the conference had a tremendous amount of opportunity for me to engage formally and informally in those discussions. So I thought from that point of view and what my own objectives were in attending, those objectives were fully met. I just have sort of a one slide to go to here, which just structures my my thoughts a little bit, and hopefully guide you a little bit, something to look at as I hopefully don't ramble for too long, but at least I give you a summary of some of the perspective that I gained from the conference. Certainly, I think the discussions that sort of focused on policy issues were very much predicated on the fact that CITS technology, it's here now. It's transforming the transportation service sector in revolutionary ways and in many respects unanticipated ways. And of course, there's some risks and opportunities associated with that. But compared to the past, the technology is very much viewed as being here now, and the role of governments is therefore being seized with how do you manage the issues going forward, and specifically how do you leverage the positive benefits that are associated with these technologies while at the same time mitigating the risks. And in that, can we define government's role versus what others may do in industry, for example, or academia or others, and even between governments and different jurisdictions, how do you define the appropriate roles of each? And then that flows into, do we have the right platforms to discuss between and across governments, but also between governments and industry? Have the right platforms been constructed for these conversations going forward? Because again, coming back to the speed issue, one of the outcomes that I saw from the discussions is that collaboration is needed more than ever going forward if we're going to be able to channel the benefits of these technologies for the future. And then finally, sort of an issue around how well are we articulating the benefits of these technologies writ large? How well are policymakers and deciders understanding what the opportunities are? And how are we ensuring the public in the technologies is being strengthened as we go forward? So that speaks a little bit to a common language issue and being sure that together we're all talking the same dialogue and dialect with respect to what the promise of these technologies are. So let me just unpack a little bit of each of these areas for you, and to give you a little bit of a sense of sort of what I heard. So, going back to government recognizing the potential, there was an excellent ministers' roundtable, 28 different jurisdictions represented, which talked about where different countries are coming from in terms of understanding the benefits. And I think you can package the benefits from how governments are looking at these technologies sort of in two or three pots. And I would say the first pot is around efficiency, environmental outcomes. The fact that there's very positive benefits that can be achieved, obviously for the fluidity of the system and its productivity, but also on the environmental side. And so a number of objectives set out. And I think the fact that the conference was happening just on the eve of the COP21, which just has been concluding in Paris, there was very much, given that we're in Europe and we were in France, the fact that COP21 seized with those reduction of GHGs emissions, the linkage made to ITS and how that can really advance those broader objectives. And I think in that, too, was a strong focus on urban congestion and the very difficult and complex challenges of the urban areas, and how ITS offers a prompt for greater fluidity and different kinds of choices, again, getting to service as a mobility as a service ideas in that. And then finally, the safety issue and the fact that clearly this is also another way to get policy and policymakers' attention. The fact that accident rates and the promise of ITS, the reduction of those accident rates, and how they're very high, and often in the discussions that I was participating in, the figure of 94% or thereabouts as the promise of the fact that 94% of accident rates are, if you reduce that, taking human judgment out of things, and ITS has a promise of that, you're going to see those numbers drop. So that being very compelling. The specific example in the UK where 30 families a week lose someone to a vehicle accident. So again, that being an example of a very concrete example of how ITS shows a promise. So getting more to a world where there's real-time information provided, where there's more autonomous functions or automated functions that take over and replace sort of human judgment, again, being a real strength to the future going forward for how transportation systems can be transformed. But the speed and pace, and this is where, getting into the technology is here and now. And Eric sort of referred to this fact of how fast, quickly things are moving. And, it's really forcing, you can see with other countries in the dialogue, regulators to sit up and take notice. And frankly, having some trouble keeping up with how these technologies are transforming service offerings and what it may mean for existing regulatory frameworks. Many of these things that have been in place for many, many years. So how do you come up with more adaptable regulatory frameworks to keep up to the pace of that technology? And so it requires really better anticipating the applications of the technology and what it might mean. On one hand, you have governments that are sort of not wanting to stand in the way of innovation, so not wanting to make sure that regulatory and legislative frameworks aren't a barrier to what the promise of safety and other benefits might be. But on the other hand, understanding that things that we may do also has to make sure that the safety question is at the very top of the list in terms of what the responsibility of governments are going forward. And so, how do we support that? And I think, the world moving from sort of a research development stage to now in ITS more of a deployment stage, is there regulatory issues that need to be addressed in that? Certainly, and as Eric talked about, there's the multimodal applications as well. And so while the discussion is still at a beginning stage, and I think there is a great opportunity going forward for that sort of multimodal corridor freight management sort of logistics side of things to be discussed in greater detail, you did see the beginnings of that discussion take place in Bordeaux, which I thought was really promising, particularly given my department's mandate, which really focuses quite a bit on freight management within the system and tools that we have to think about in terms of how that efficiency of the freight management system takes place. So from that point of view, I think the speed itself is quite challenging. It's promising and exciting, but it's also quite challenging for governments in terms of managing the pace going forward. But in almost every presentation and workshop that I participated in, there was a various list of issues, policy issues and other issues put forward, which I thought was really helpful because it starts to get you gathering around a list of issues that need to be tackled. And I think from there, once you kind of come up with your exhaustive list, as government, you can start to parse out, okay, what's sort of government's role in this, what's industry's role, and sort of what's a shared shared responsibility. So I found that really useful to sort of hear about how challenges and opportunities were being put on the table in a little more of a concrete way, frankly, than I've heard before. And let me just run very quickly through the list for you. So in no particular order, but data safeguards and guarding personal information, particularly as that commercialization of personal data becomes more of a practice. And so, how governments put in safeguards to make sure that that personal data is being guarded for its intended use and not accessed by others who may use it for other purposes. So clearly that was a very strong focus. Vehicle safety was a very strong focus. Driving regulations, including driver distraction. And of course, as more automation comes, how do you balance the fact that you've got more widgets and gadgets to deal with in the vehicle, and that adds to distraction, but actually has the potential to further inform the driver. Liability issues, questions around liability, obviously, and who's responsible in the case of incidents. And so the insurance industry looking at that, but it does flow through to regimes put in place like the Vienna Convention in Europe, and of course our regimes in North America as well. Interoperability of systems across jurisdictional boundaries, an issue I'll get into a little bit more in a minute. But France noted, for example, they're really facing coherence problems between governmental authorities and local authority policies. And so how do you facilitate that interoperability is key. And of course, interoperability offers you the promise of the technology reaching further and being deployed further going forward. So again, not wanting to stand in the way and that coordination being so critical. Funding, dedication, and eligibility. Obviously, the needs far outstrip government's ability to sort of incent or assist with deployment issues. And so how do you construct sort of a framework for eligibility where you're able to target your actions and be strategic about where the gaps may be, where there's a push from government that might be helpful? Infrastructure readiness and certification. I think this is an area, and I'll come back to it later, where probably further discussion would be useful in terms of the infrastructure side of things and how do you ready infrastructure for ITS deployment. Cybersecurity was a big question, and I think that's one that was singled out as perhaps no silver bullet being available yet. And the July 2015 Jeep Cherokee incident, where hackers in a planned way were able to overtake the systems of a Jeep, and of course ended up in a recall of Jeeps. But that is something being identified that there's no obvious solution to that just yet. Public confidence issues, and again, I'll come back to the public confidence issue, but certainly a prerequisite for public confidence being viewed as making sure you got that privacy question right, and to a degree the security issue addressed. And then, of course, there's transition issues, the fact that you're not living in a clean world where you move smoothly and quickly to ITS deployed everywhere or automated vehicles being deployed everywhere. In fact, you're going to live in a world that's a hybrid. You have fleet operators buying fleets for 10 to 15 years. You have a mix of vehicles on the road. How do you deal with that transition period? So again, and then finally, training, identified as training on these sorts of technologies, identified as an unanticipated economic cost or gap. And so how do you address that? So I found that really instructive in terms of a list, and I'm sure there's others to add, but that's probably enough for now, and I think gives quite a bit to chew on in terms of how do we think our way forward. But as we think our way forward, specifically in the context of automated vehicles and connected vehicles, the square questions focused on how do we ensure they work safely together. The fact that harmonization through regulatory cooperation can speed that deployment, how do you achieve that, being a key question. And so dovetailed with that is, as I mentioned, the insurance issues and dovetailing with your Vienna Convention and so on. How do you deal with those issues so that you're clearing the pathway for CV/AV deployment and we're not standing in the way? Related to that is sort of your pathway to your logistics corridor management, your transportation, freight movements, and so on. I was encouraged by some of the discussions that I heard about how much attention is being paid to this. And certainly the objective of greater intermodal integration is being pursued through ITS, that ITS allows you to sort of have that synchronized, integrated, and anticipatory way of dealing with your freight movements where you can achieve that various actors within your supply chain can talk to each other, and the supply chain is made more visible by digitization of movements and documents. And so a real need to understand how digitization of that supply chain can happen, and some of it being shepherded by certain countries, for example, Portugal mandating that truck movements will need to be mapped. Examples, for example, the Port of Hamburg in terms of their truck movements around the port and a reservation system so there's not long lineups. That's something very similar to what we're pursuing here in Canada. And so the corridor management issue starting to be very much of a focus, perhaps not all that organized yet, but some promising areas where you see in the EU the 10T corridors initiative, the sort of mapping of their most strategic corridors being used to say, okay, where do we need to deploy ITS so it gets biggest bang for its buck and we get our interoperable systems working together to make sure that we've got a better mapping of our system and a better utilization efficiency of our freight transportation system. So government's very much focused on that element. Moving into the role of governments being better defined going forward, a number of strategies have been recently articulated by some key governments, whether has recently released a strategy defining their approach to ITS, and it interestingly ties together the infrastructure piece to the broadband, to how they're looking at AVs and CVs, and so a very nice package, I think, put forward by Germany. You've got the United States, with some of you will be familiar with their deployment projects in 3 regional areas in the U.S. of automated connected vehicles, in particular on the connected vehicle side. You hear the UK with their interesting model around innovation and how they're recognizing the potential of ITS as a strategically important sector to the UK on their innovation push writ large. So you have countries positioning themselves and tying ITS from the point of view of sometimes their industrial strategy. If they've got a strong automotive sector, you really see that connection made. If they've got a strong innovation push, such as the UK, you see that sort of wrapped up in their strategy. If you see the fact that they're coming at it more from a regulatory standpoint, like Australia, they're making sure they're tying together their need for regulatory harmonization with the EU, for example, but they're tackling it from a privacy and regulatory point of view. So I found that very interesting in terms of how different countries are positioning themselves and then articulating their role and their strategy going forward, which then flows to this idea of, do we have the right platforms? And I think what's really encouraging is two things. One is there's a recognition that, there's a lot of transportation players. It is fragmented, across the transportation space in terms of there could be thousands of transportation service providers operating within a local area or a regional area. And so how are you organizing a conversation that kind of brings them together? Because it's not just the tool, it's the willingness to come together and leverage the tool to their full potential. And I think that's sort of another outcome that I saw in some of the government discussions, is that getting the platforms right where we can talk is very critical to how we leverage the technology. So do we have the right platforms to talk between governments? And so the recent, and I was privileged to join the G7 discussions, first transport ministers meeting actually that happened under the auspices of the G7. And so the first sort of topics to discuss in that very first meeting, which will continue, was a focus on automated and connected vehicles, as well as financing for infrastructure. So those two topics will carry through to Nagano next September. But that platform being considered very important for how governments can compare notes on what they're doing and also make sure that harmonization discussions and regulatory cooperation can take place and have some push as well from the political level. I also saw and participated informally in a CITS group chaired by the EU, which again is pulling together government players where they're trying to map research that's being done, deployment projects that are being conducted, and can, instead of each country running out and duplicating all the work, can they leverage off of each part of what different countries are doing, leveraging the strengths and niche positions each country play. So the EU is challenged with trying to bring that together and mapping out, in fact, what different countries are doing so there's a better coherence, perhaps, in where gaps are identified and then can be tackled going forward. But equally important is that government to industry play, where there's a need very much to get a clear line of sight with industry by governments for how technology is moving, where it may be applied, and therefore what impact it may have on regulations for good or for bad. And so that dialogue with industry being very critical. So two instructive examples there, EU Commissioner Violeta Bulc, who described the need for a global strategy or roadmap for the deployment of cooperative systems to ensure all operators work together. And that links are made in that to industry to make sure that the systems are interoperable and that the right investments are made in the sector by industry as well. From the U.S. in an informal way, the U.S. sort of being rather frank in terms of the new players in the space, Google, Apple, Uber, but in particular in the case of Apple and Uber, where it's not entirely clear what they're working on. Huge investments made by these companies in connected and automated vehicles, but not entirely clear what the end game plan is. And that does speak to the fact that we are dealing with industry players in transportation who haven't typically dealt in any sort of sophisticated way with some new players who are software developers and other kinds of developers. And that dialogue probably isn't that strong. Those platforms probably aren't that well established. So how do you strengthen that dialogue between government and industry to make sure you've got the right discussion, government has what it needs to understand the technology, and on the other hand, there's just a better line of sight as to how things are evolving. Finally, I'll just end off with the fact that communication, a really strong and good point brought up about how communication and the language used around these technologies needs to be a bit clearer. So industry has a responsibility as they're talking to policymakers and deciders in a language that's consistent. Even there's some jokes made about we talk about interoperability and standardization, but the fact is even the language around many of these technologies is not standardized. So it's not clear sometimes what's being talked about. It's not clear sometimes, are we talking about the same problems? Are we just talking about AVCVs, or are we talking more generally about the impact of information communication technology across the sector? So speaking a little bit more with one voice, using a common language, and being more disciplined in our use of terms, being absolutely critical. And the other piece of it is the infrastructure piece. And I think there's an opportunity in Nagano, but also in future discussions, to talk about that readiness of infrastructure. How much readiness is required, particularly as we're going more towards phone-based infrastructure. And what does that mean for hard infrastructure? And that's critical because there's long lead plan times required for infrastructure builds, and not often thought about by infrastructure builders to think about the technology aspect and how do you build that in the front end. So I'll leave it there, and I appreciate if there's any questions, I can certainly address them.
Well, thank you very much, Craig. I found your remarks and Eric's very, very thought-provoking and interesting. Um, Clearly, I think our close cooperation with the U.S. and the kinds of harmonization efforts that you and your colleagues are entering into through the RCC and others are going to be key going forward. Maybe just crystal ball for me, what do you think are the implications for our conference in 2017 in terms of how we can respond to some of those harmonization efforts and how we can demonstrate those to the world?
Well, I think the good news is there's quite a bit of dialogue happening now, and I think in Canada we are seeing through the Council of Ministers responsible for transportation and highway safety a more concerted effort to draw what have been to date some fragmented discussion between different entities under that Council of Ministers, bring together a little in a more focused way who's working on what. Sort of there's a road design piece, there's a sort of vehicle piece, there's a policy piece that needs, and all those discussions need to come together sort of from a domestic point of view. And that will also help in how we shape our international discussion, whether it's G7 for Nagano next September, or how we're working currently with the Americans and how we continue to evolve it. And certainly through the Regulatory Cooperation Council, or the RCC, there's already been really robust discussions going on about CVs, AVs in that context. And so I think it's, again, defining the role of government in terms of what more needs to be done. So I think there's lots of work there, and I think Montreal gives a great target also to shoot towards in terms of making sure that we're able to well articulate Canada's approach, and we'll need to get there even before Montreal. And I would just add that we've got a report that will be coming in, the Canada Transportation Act review, headed by the Honourable David Emerson, who will be providing shortly his report to the Minister of Transport, who will be making that public sort of early winter timeframe. That will probably and contain some commentary, as the Minister had asked that some commentary be provided around technology. So that report, I think, will also offer a good platform for further discussion, and ITS Canada put in an excellent submission to that review. So some good ideas should be reflected there.
Well, thank you, Craig. Very, very good input, and hopefully our audience is enjoying this conversation as much as I am. I'm going to put you on mute now, Craig, and switch over to Michael. Michael, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Good, good. So good morning. Michael DeSantis is the president of MI8 Innovation. Can you see my screen, Michael, right now?
Let me see. No, I do not.
Okay, sorry. I'll make sure that mine's visible. There we go.
There you go.
Yeah, good. Michael's a graduate of the École Polytechnique de Montréal with a degree in civil engineering and has been involved in ITS for over 20 years. He's also the chair of ITS Canada, which puts him right in the crosshairs of everything that's going on in ITS in Canada and around the world. He tends to be our ambassador to other countries and is working closely with ITS organizations around the world. As president of MI8, he provides expertise involving feasibility studies, planning, design, and implementation regarding smart and sustainable mobility of goods and people. As president of ITS Canada, he's also, actively working towards the organization of the 24th ITS World Congress and was part of the, or actually led the committee that brought that Congress to Montreal in 2017. So without any further ado, I'd like to pass the gavel over to Michael here. Michael, I'm going to do that to you right now. And I'll let you take over the presentation.
Thank you, Rob. Hold on. There. Do you see my screen?
I do.
Okay. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your participation. I assume, being the last speaker, correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, do I have like 5 or 10 minutes to present?
I think seven minutes is about right, maybe 8.
Well, that's okay. First, before I go into my presentation, I do really want to thank Eric and Craig for your excellent presentations. As Rob mentioned, definitely food for thought, working towards 2017. On one hand, Eric, your suggestions or what takeaways you had for future ideas for consideration, and Craig, especially as Rob mentioned, how ITS, how the World Congress could help Transport Canada with their ITS agenda. As mentioned by Eric, it was definitely a very busy week in Bordeaux. For the better part of the 5 days, it seemed to me that I landed on Monday, and the next thing I knew, we were Friday. There were many activities, and for the most part, we didn't get to see everything. For ITS Canada and ITS America's perspectives, our participation at the World Congress was in many ways focused on collecting information that could contribute to making the 2017 World Congress in Montreal a success for the organizer, but more importantly for the delegates. The City of Montreal also had a strong delegation, as was mentioned by Rob, led by the chair of the 2017 World Congress Organizing Committee, Monsieur Claude Carrette. As well, he had a number of his key staff who are involved in the World Congress organization were present in Bordeaux, taking notes. There were some logistic elements worth noting, as was mentioned by Eric. The important one consisting of having separate facilities for exhibit and the conference facility. From my perspective, I'm certain the distance that separating the two facilities may have affected session attendance. But as was mentioned by Eric, the use of an AV shuttle between the two sites was an excellent idea. And I also found that the technology demonstration showcase highlighted well AV's function in the world environment. The ways from the technology demonstration perspectives on how to improve on the execution of a technology showcase. So quite a few notes were taken from that perspective. As we all saw from Eric's presentation, many concepts were presented in Bordeaux, and it seems as if everything is becoming instrumented, digital, and interconnected. Data at the core of this fundamental shift, and it is now more accessible and is driving a number of the changes we see. For operators and users alike, it seems that connectivity has become a key element to efficient mobility. And as was mentioned, we're moving from a management of assets to provisions of services. I'll start with our theme. As for most of you know, this theme was set about a year ago, and it emphasizes this seamless mobility in a connected world. But what impacts will this have looking forward to Montreal in 2017? It's become obvious that connectivity and integrated services will contribute immensely to an environment where seamless mobility becomes a reality in the world of tomorrow. This means breaking down silos, sharing data, using multimodal transport networks based on real-time information that allow users to make informed decisions regarding their mobility options. as the lead organization, ITS America has undertaken a market analysis that will contribute to refining the vision for 2017 for the World Congress. And this work is currently underway and should be completed shortly. But in the meantime, there are a few considerations. I'm glad I hadn't noticed Eric's presentation, but some of the elements that he pointed out are definitely some that will be considered in 2017. First and foremost, the youth involvement. As we saw in past World Congresses, the youth involvement may be through hackathons or the Connections Showcase, as was presented in Detroit, were very successful on many levels, as well as inspirational. The ICT community, as was mentioned before, big data, data analytics, Internet of Things, are playing an ever more important role in shaping the future of mobility. Leading up to smart cities and its incorporation in the World Congress. And I agree with Eric, there's more than just smart mobility. As the diagram shows, you do have other vectors. They should be, in my opinion, showcased as well in a World Congress. The other aspect is collaborative and connected ITS. A good example would be integration of the public transit, car, and bike sharing through one access card. And that is the case here in Montreal. And by 2017, this concept will be a reality. And my hope is that delegates will benefit from this prior to their visit to Montreal, during, and as well after. In many ways, this is reflected in a recent article by Richard Harris from Xerox in the ITS Review UK, where he suggested we should transition from intelligent transportation systems to integrated transportation services. And we're seeing that concept becoming a reality more and more. We talked about e-mobility. The idea is to have the opportunity to present to delegates this concept of e-mobility, such as what was just been recently deployed here in Montreal, the TO Taxi. It's been launched just a few weeks ago as a pilot with the idea, with success, of having 1,000 electric taxis, intelligent taxis deployed by 2017. And further on 2,000 or so within 4 years. As was mentioned, freight and logistics as well. We all know the importance of goods movement to economic development. I agree with Craig, better awareness and demonstration of the role ITS plays in efficient movement of goods highlighted at this World Congress. 2017, as was said many times, is a celebratory year for Canadians, Montrealers alike. The idea here is to bring within the World Congress some elements of the celebration. We also will be celebrating ITS Canada, our 20. So it'll be a special year for ITS Canada, as well as Canadians and Montrealers alike. I would be remiss not to mention the next World Congress in Melbourne and encourage listeners to consider attending. We will be presenting, actually, ITS Canada and ITS America will be promoting the 2017 World Congress, and we will be present in Melbourne as well to promote Montreal. The Australians, ITS Australia and its partners have prepared an exciting program comprising 8 topics. I encourage you all to visit their website to obtain information regarding their World Congress. And it's not too late to even submit a paper. The launch for submission was in October, and the deadline is 13 January. So you have more than enough time to work over the holiday season on a paper and present at the World Congress in Melbourne. So again, I encourage you to visit their website for more detail. But in the meantime, regarding the World Congress in 2017, ITS America has set up a site where you can sign up to be on their mailing list. And this would be the first step. And we will use this channel as well as the Twitter feeds indicated to provide information to all those who have subscribed. More on the World Congress in terms of, or 2017 in terms of vision and scope will probably commence, will be pretty much in development in the new year. So more on that will be forthcoming. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this webinar, and I'm open for questions. Merci.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and good job. I think that provided an excellent summary of what we saw in Montreal, in Bordeaux, and what we have to look forward to in Montreal. I don't see any questions from our audience, and because we're past the hour, I see some of the folks are starting to leave now. So, with your permission, I'd like to just wrap up now, and then we can certainly circulate the presentations and the recording to all of our attendees. And if there are further questions, we'd be glad to respond to those either directly or through email.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. So I'll take control back of this presentation, and then hopefully you can see my screen. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. This has been a very informative webinar. We hope that you'll join us for the next quarterly webinar, which happens in sometime in February. And on that one, we're going to be focusing on what's upcoming for the 2016 annual conference in Calgary, which is being held May 1st to 4th in Calgary. Should be pretty nice weather in Calgary by May. It's a beautiful city and beautiful surroundings for those of you who've never been there. I'm proud to say that because of the efforts of our Secretariat staff, that we've pretty much sold out the exhibits. There's only a few exhibit spaces left. We have a very strong local organizing committee led by a couple of local people in Calgary, Yates Wong from the City of Calgary and Judy Yu from Associated Engineering. And we have a strong technical program that is being developed by a committee led by Keenan Kitasaka. So I would encourage all of you to think about registering for this conference. If you're interested in sponsoring the conference, please do get in touch with myself or with Janneke Polking, who's our administrator, and we would be pleased to take you up on your offer to sponsor the conference. And with that, I'd like to wish you all season's greetings. Looking forward to some quiet time with your family, and hopefully all of you have a very successful Christmas period and look forward to a happy and successful new year. Thank you very much, and I'll sign off now.